Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to be looking at something very special. It's called How Reason Can Lead to God. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm once again, just as we did last time, I'm going to basically go over each chapter in the book and basically kind of explain what I think of it and some of the arguments. Now, overall, this book I recommend everybody to read. I don't care if you're an atheist, I don't care if you're a Gnostic or a theist, no matter which religion you hold to, no matter what your beliefs are, I think this book everybody should read. And I'm not saying it just so that people can be convinced that God exists. Again, that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to kind of get a new perspective on how one can look at God and how one can see that there's a foundation for reality. And this book, it was not technical at all. Like, it was very easy to understand. It was very interesting. I think that he used kind of a lot of the same arguments that theists typically use, and he kind of combines them into one argument, which we're going to get into near the end. But I think if you want to understand, if you want to like seriously study philosophy of religion, this book I would highly recommend. And again, it's not technical, so you don't need to have like some complex understanding of, philosophy. You can just literally pick it up and read it. It's pretty easy to understand, so it's not technical at all. And that's kind of what I liked, is it's not technical, but at the same time, it's also, there's pretty good arguments in it as well. So we're going to kind of go over that today. We're going to go over each chapter and kind of explore what Josh Rasmussen has to say about the existence of God. So the first chapter goes into what's called When Reason Leads to Doubt. Now here he doesn't really give any argument per se, but he does go over kind of like his personal journey of how when he started to doubt the existence of a god or whatever. And he goes into how reason can sometimes lead to doubt. And it should, at least if we're seeking truth, we should challenge our beliefs. We should be honest with ourselves, right? We should change our beliefs based on the evidence. And if we're seekers of truth, then we should always do that. And that's kind of what Josh is getting at here, where he's not interested necessarily in being a religious zealot or whatever. He's interested in getting what's true about the nature of reality and what's true about the world. And I think that's the most important thing that we as seekers of truth should be always trying to do, and that's what Josh is doing. So chapter 1 kind of just goes over his personal journey, his personal experience of when he started to doubt the faith. Now, another thing I want to point out here is throughout the book, there is no injection of faith brought into it. I believe every chapter is arrived at through reason. So he doesn't use faith, or in other words, he doesn't try to, put God or try to put Jesus into it. He uses reason to actually lead to his conclusion. That's near the end of the book, which we will get into, but I just want to point that out, that there's nothing in the book where he tries to sneak in some blind faith or whatever. He's constantly using reason to kind of reach his conclusions. So I just want to point that out, that he is a seeker of truth, and that's why, a lot of people on both sides respect him. So anyways, that's chapter 1. Now chapter 2, he gets into what's called the bridge of reason. And this bridge is kind of like how you get from non-belief to a God. And he kind of lays out the bridge in the first chapter. Now, one of the things that he gets into here is specifically like the very first step of how we come to know about the world. And that is that, how do we know that anything exists at all? Like, how do we even have the belief that anything exists at all? Now, of course, one could always say like, oh, I see reality as it is, so therefore something exists. Well, that could work, but again, you kind of gotta ask the question: well, is there any reality at all? Obviously there is. And what he uses the example of is yourself, your mind, that Even if everything is a dream, the dream itself exists. If everything is an illusion, the experience of your illusion exists. So you cannot begin to be deceived if there is no one to be deceived. And finally, and if doubt exists, or if you doubt the existence of anything, well, then doubt exists. Doubt is something, therefore something exists. So that's page 9 and 10 if you're interested in reading that part. But basically what he shows is how anytime we ask the question, does something exist, we're already presupposing that something exists, because the very fact that we're asking that question means that there's something there that's asking the question. And so we can know, at least initially, that there is something that exists in nature, and that thing is ourselves. Like, we know that something exists. Okay, so that's that's the very first step you have to make in order to get to the conclusion, which he's going to get into at the end. But anyways, so basically chapter 1 is kind of laying out the fact that we can know something exists. Okay, now the next step is whether or not something that exists has always existed. And so he gets into what's called the blob of everything. Now, just a quote here, it says, quote, "The idea is that existing things include all things, whatever their nature. I make no claim about which things in particular exist. All we need is something, whatever it might be." So once again, he gets into the blob of everything. And he calls the blob of everything as everything that could possibly exist. And what he means by everything that exists, he's not just talking about the physical universe. He's talking about every possible reality. So this includes any supernatural reality or any supernatural, like literally any reality that you add on to reality is basically what's called the totality of reality. And so what he argues, at least he makes the point, that the totality of reality is self-sufficient. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that there can be nothing outside of all of reality that causes reality to exist. Now, this is very important because typically people will bring up, like, for example, the supernatural. Like, oh, well, there's a supernatural reality that caused the physical reality to come from. But again, we need to ask, okay, well, if that's the case, well, then what caused supernatural reality to come into existence? Well, then you're going to have kind of an infinite regress. If there's something that's outside of the supernatural reality, then that would still be part of all reality, right? So he makes the point here that the totality of reality is self-sufficient. And he calls this totality of reality the blob of everything. And he actually makes an argument for why this has to always exist. So he says so he lays out some principles. So principle 1 is that no existing thing is outside the blob of everything. And then principle number 2 is that nothing outside the blob of everything caused the blob of everything to exist. So he kind of goes into the argument. Number 1, the blob of everything includes all that exists. Therefore, no existing thing is outside the blob of everything. Therefore, no existing cause is outside the blob of everything. And finally, therefore, no existing cause outside the blob of everything caused the blob of everything to exist. And so, in short, he says, nothing is outside the blob of everything, and therefore nothing outside the blob of everything caused the blob. And so, what he gets into here is that if this is true, which it is inductively speaking, then this has some pretty interesting implications. He says, quote, "I have heard it proposed that something or someone is the transcendent cause of everything, but that cannot be true. Principle 2 contradicts a strict interpretation of the proposal, for if something transcends all things, then this something is not among the existing things. In that case, there is something that is not something, and therefore we have a contradiction. To avoid this contradiction, we should distinguish between something that transcends all and something that transcends all else. Nothing can transcend all, nothing is beyond all, therefore nothing outside existence causes existence. This result is significant, and I will seek to tease out its implications." So he goes into the implications, and so the implication is he goes into principle number 3, which is that nothing outside the blob of everything explains why or how the blob of everything exists. He says, quote, "Just as nothing outside the blob of everything caused the blob of everything to exist, so too nothing outside the blob of everything could serve as its ultimate explanation. So therefore, nothing outside existence explains existence." And so that's pretty much the implication. Like, there is nothing outside of existence itself that could actually explain why things exist. Because if there was, then that thing would also exist as well, and so we would need to explain why that other thing exists. And so that's pretty much the implication, that there is nothing outside of everything, basically. And so he says, quote, "The blob of everything has no outside explanation or outside cause of its existence." He says, quote, "Even complex systems like computers, solar systems, and galaxies emerge from prior states of reality. Indeed, every chunk of reality, big or small, appears to depend upon other things. If you can think of exceptions, surely they are not part of everyday experiences. Exceptions are odd, unusual, and strange. The blob of everything is an exception, however." So what he kind of gets into, basically, is like the blob of everything has to exist. That it's the foundation, basically, for everything. So he goes into, so just kind of summarize chapter 2, he says, quote, "To take the first step into the bridge, see that something exists. It could be anything, you, your thoughts, or your doubts. If you agree that something exists, then you have taken the first step onto the bridge." And so he goes into how, if this is the case, then there is nothing outside of that which all that exists, basically. So that's kind of the first step into how you reach the conclusion. Now, chapter 3, he goes into what he calls the foundational theory, or the foundation theory. So basically, the foundation theory is the idea, he says, quote, "The foundational layer, in other words, provides the ultimate basis for the existence of everything else. The foundation of things enables there to be things as opposed to there being nothing at all. Can this account of existence, or I call this account of existence, the foundation theory." So the foundation theory is basically the idea that there has to be a foundation for all that exists. Like, if reality is self-sufficient, then there has to be a foundation by which that thing actually exists. So there's kind of three principles that he gets into. So the first being is what he calls independence. And independence, he says, quote, "In order for any realm of any size to be self-sufficient, that realm must contain some independent layer or component. I will explain how this principle works and how I think it is true using 3 layers of thought. The first layer is the root of self-sufficiency. And so a self-sufficient realm and a dependent realm." So he kind of makes this distinction between a self-sufficient realm and then, of course, a dependent realm. So what he says is that if reality is self-sufficient, which it would be if there's nothing outside of itself, that it must have what's called this independent nature, that there's something in the self-sufficiency of nature that is the foundation of that nature. So it says, quote, "The blob of everything has no outside cause or outside explanation, since it includes everything. Your sock drawer, by contrast, is not like that. Something beyond the drawer made the drawer and your socks inside." So he gets into, again, the distinction between what's called dependence and independence. So dependence is something that has an outside explanation, whereas independence is something that does not have an outside explanation. So he says, quote, "Your socks, by contrast, only exist because something produced them. They have a dependent nature. For this reason, your socks cannot be the foundation of all of existence." So he makes the point that whatever the foundation of existence is, it does not have a dependent nature, basically. And so he says, quote, "These self-sufficient elements then provide the ultimate foundation for everything else." So again, if something is either self-dependent or the foundational thing, then that would kind of be the foundation for all that exists. So he actually makes an argument for this. He says, number 1, a realm cannot be self-sufficient without an independent layer, because independence is the root of self-sufficiency. Premise 2, the blob of everything is a self-sufficient realm, because there is nothing beyond everything. Therefore, the blob of everything has an independent foundation. So this is, again, just kind of layering out the first idea that whatever the foundation is, it has to have an independent nature. So now the layer 2 is what's called construction. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but I'm going to basically lay out his basic idea. So the basic idea is that purely dependent things by themselves cannot construct a self-sufficient totality. That's because constructing a self-sufficient totality from dependent things or non-self-sufficient things, materials, commits a construction error. So I'm going to get into the construction error later, not right now, because I think it'll it's kind of, I don't think it's necessary right now because this will be important when we get into the philosophy of mind aspect. But for now, I just want to lay out the point that that whatever the foundation is, it has to be independent, and you can't build dependence and then form independence. So I'm going to quote again. So it says, quote, increasing the age also makes no difference. And so he makes this point because some people will say, oh, what if the totality of reality is itself eternal? Well, there's a little problem here. So imagine a floor has existed for a year. This floor is not thereby independent. A floor composed of dependent tiles is a dependent floor for as long as it exists. Even if a floor exists for infinitely many years, the floor depends on its tile for as long as they exist. To form a non-dependent or self-sufficient floor from purely dependent tiles of any age commits a construction error. And so, again, this is kind of laying out the fact that just because you add an infinite amount of dependent things, this is not going to create an independent nature or an independent foundation. So he also lays out what's called the dependence principle, which is simply that purely dependent things themselves form dependent totals. Okay, so now we're going to get into what's called the independent nature, which is like which says, quote, without an independent nature, by contrast, we have a construction problem. For then, everything has a purely dependent nature, yet dependent is an insufficient basis for a blob that is not dependent. To avoid this construction error, then we need a non-dependent foundation, or in other words, we need what's called an independent nature. So let's kind of review a little bit. So basically, so the foundation has to be independent, and you can't build independence from dependence. So therefore, whatever has always existed must itself be independent, basically. So that's kind of the idea. Now he does lay out another reason why this foundation has to be what's called independent, but I'm not going to get into it here because I think people should just read the book. So yeah. And then the second beam, which is what he calls necessity. And this is basically the idea that whatever the independent nature is, it has to exist in every possible world, basically. Now, again, I'm not going to get into it here because, again, I want people to read the book for themselves to kind of get the idea. Basically, the idea is that, so I'm going to just kind of quote to kind of get his basic concept. So it says, quote, before you formed the mug, it was merely a potential reality. In order for that potential reality to become actual, something had to make it actual. The hypothetical clay, by contrast, is necessarily actual. Therefore, it never passes from a merely potential reality into an actual reality. Nothing could actualize itself since it necessarily is already actual. So he gets into what's called Aristotelian metaphysics, which is kind of complex. But basically the idea is like you can't produce a whatever potential reality exists cannot itself produce an actual reality unless there's something actual that's already there that made it actual. And so yeah, it's pretty much the idea. And I'm just gonna kind of lay out the principles that he lays out here. So he lays out the principle of self-sufficiency, which is that whatever has a self-sufficient nature has a necessary nature. And then the principle of insufficiency is simply that whatever has a dependent nature lacks a necessary nature. So he makes the connection here between an independent nature or self-sufficient nature and a necessary nature. That whatever is independent and self-sufficient is always going to also be necessary in every possible world. So yeah. And then the third beam is what he calls ultimacy. And basically, I'm not going to go too much into it here. If I'm going to summarize it here, the basic idea is that whatever the foundation is, it is the ultimate foundation for everything. And then just to kind of make a little extra point here, he also lays out what's called the principle of actuality, which is that whatever is actual but potentially not actual depends on an actualizer. So again, that's kind of the whole point of the story. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. But that's for chapter 3. Now, chapter 4, he gets into the objections to this foundational theory. And again, the foundational theory was simply that because reality is self-sufficient, then it has to have an independent nature, a necessary nature, and an ultimate nature. So it has to be self-sufficient, independent, and yeah. So I'm sure you guys get the idea, but that's basically what it is. Now, chapter 4 gets into the objections to the foundation theory. So I'm not going to go over every objection here, but I will go over what I think are the best ones to kind of summarize it. So the first objection has to do with infinite regress. And so it says, quote, "The argument from the foundation theory assumes, without justification, that the chain of cause and effect must be finite, but suppose instead the chain is infinite. Each state of the universe is like a domino that was knocked into existence by a prior state, that each state is actualized or made actual by another state, and there is no ultimate foundation." So this is actually very common among atheists, that there could actually be an infinite regress of causes. But Josh actually responds to this argument. And he says, quote, "I actually do not assume that the chain of causes must be finite. The infinite regress objection, though common, does not actually touch the bridge of reason I have been constructing." And he says, quote, "The foundation is not something that comes before the chain of causes. Rather, the foundation is the ultimate basis of everything across time." So the basic idea is, even if there's an infinite regress, it would still require some independent, necessary foundation to ground the infinite regress. So yeah, that's basically the idea. That he kind of like reviews from the previous chapter, which he says, quote, "Without any foundation, by contrast, dependent things, even if they're infinite, like tables and chairs, would never be able to exist at all if there was no independent nature by which they exist from." So again, this is kind of the whole point, that even if there's an infinite regress, you still need a foundation to ground that infinite regress. So in fact, he says this. He says, quote, "Infinite chain would only reinforce the need for a foundation. Consider this. A foundation explains how things manage to exist for so long. If things have always existed, how did they last that long? Why don't the basic elements simply vanish like vapor a long time ago? Without a foundation, we have a solution. Things continue to exist because the foundation of reality is unable not to exist. Extending the age of the world out into infinity doesn't undermine this result, it points it out." So again, this is the basic idea that purely dependent things cannot produce an independent totality. Therefore, you need an independent totality or an independent nature or foundation to kind of ground the infinite dependent things in the world. So I found it very interesting how even with an infinite regress, you would still need the foundation to kind of ground it. So that's the first objection, and that's kind of the response that he gives. Now again, I'm not going to go over every objection. I'm just going to go over what I think are the best ones. So the objection 2 is what's called the fallacy of composition. So the basic idea here is that it's a composition fallacy to say that dependent things could not produce an independent thing. Like, that's a fallacy of composition. And so he responds to this by actually pointing out that this does not threaten the argument, basically. So he says, quote, "I use a principle of dependence according to which dependence flows from part to a whole. Although it is fallacious to assume that all wholes have all dependent properties of their parts, it is not fallacious to infer that certain wholes have certain properties of their parts. Some properties are indeed wholly inherited. They flow from parts to whole. For example, whiteness, marble, and glassiness flow from parts to whole. Thus, it is not fallacious to infer that a floor composed of right tiles is itself white, or that stacks of marble is itself marble. Similarly, it is not fallacious to infer that dependent things form an independent totality. These inferences tracks everything we know and experience." So again, this is kind of the argument. Moreover, a fallacy of composition actually highlights the strength of the beams of our bridge. The fallacy of composition highlights the constraints of construction. So consider the following argument. Number 1, each section of reality has an outside cause. Number 2, therefore, the entirety of reality has an outside cause. This argument is worse than fallacious. It is contradictory. For as we saw in Chapter 2, no cause can be outside of all causes. To construct reality, we need an unconstructed foundation. Otherwise, we commit a construction error. So again, the composition fallacy kind of highlights the need for a foundation. It doesn't show that we don't need one, rather it actually shows that we do need a foundation. So again, I'm not going to go over every objection. I'm going to skip number 3 and number 4, as well as number 5 and number 6, I think. Hold on. Yeah, number 6 as well, because again, I think that people should just read the book, honestly. So I'm going to get into objection 8. This will be the last objection we're going to go over. Basically, the objection is this, that, quote, creation either has a necessary existence or not. Both options cause trouble. If creation has necessary existence, then everything has necessary existence. Surely, not everything has necessary existence, therefore creation does not have necessary existence. But if creation does not have necessary existence, we have another trouble. By the principle of actuality, something must have actualized creation. But what could do that? Things in E cannot construct actual creation because E depends on creation. That leaves a foundation. Could the foundation create creation? No, creation is the link, not the effect. If the foundation creates creation, then creation is the effect, not the link. Therefore, creation cannot exist. So this is the contemporary objection that is kind of brought up. So he actually responds to this. He says, quote, on a basic level, something actualizes an effect by making some potential actual. This basic idea, however, leads to a puzzle about how anything can have, or how anything can make anything actual. So his basic response to this argument is a little complex. Not going to get too much into it. But he says, quote, instead of exposing the problem with a necessary foundation, it points instead to a feature of the necessary foundation. Consider this. If everything is a necessary consequence of the necessary foundation, then everything is necessary, full stop. And so part of the necessary totality. Yet apparently not everything is necessarily full stop. For example, my current thoughts can fail to exist. If that is right, then the necessary foundation is capable of selecting certain effects among alternative possibilities. In this sense, the foundation has a form of choice. So the basic idea is that just because the foundation is necessary does not mean that all its effects are necessary. In other words, it would seem that the foundation, if it necessarily exists, could actually choose among alternative possibilities. And so this actually highlights kind of a nature for the foundation, which is that it has a mind-like nature. So yeah, that's pretty much chapter 4, which gets to the objections. Now chapter 5, I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's called Eternal Power. It's basically pointing out the fact that the foundation of everything has to always exist. Like, it's eternal. Like, it can't not exist. So I'm not going to go, this chapter is very short, and basically the idea is that the foundation would have to be eternal. And I think that's pretty much already proven from the fact that it has to always exist. So I'm not going to get into it, but I would just recommend other people read the book. So now chapter 6 goes into pure actuality, or purely actual. So this is probably one of my favorite chapters because it highlights the need for an actualizer, or something that has always existed. So I'm not going to go too much into here. However, what I will highlight is what's called the problem of arbitrary limits. And so I'm going to go over this kind of section of the chapter a little bit. So the arbitrary limits is basically the idea. He says, quote, an arbitrary limit is a cutoff without an explanation. For example, if the foundation has a capacity to produce 2 to the 88th particles for no more than its capacity to produce particles, then that has a cutoff, and so it is limited. This limit is arbitrary. He says, quote, however, a foundation with arbitrary limits leads to a threefold problem. Our three tools reveal this problem from 3 angles. First, each unexplained limit multiplies complexity within the foundation, which detracts from the probability of a hypothesis about the foundation's nature. Second, each limit blocks explanatory depth by adding another unexplained bit to the foundation. Third, Each limit within the foundation breaks the uniformity of limits more generally. So those are kind of the basic objections that he brings. And so he says, quote, a simpler theory would be one that doesn't specify any cutoffs. For example, imagine a foundation with three basic attributes. 1, no mass, 2, no shape, and 3, the capacity to produce any number of particles. This theory requires fewer basic attributes and is therefore simpler to describe. The foundation's basic nature could then be described without limiting any of these limits. By the tool of simplicity, then, a theory of limitless foundation is more internally likely than the more complex theory above. In other words, the tool of simplicity provides a reason to think that the foundation lacks arbitrary limits. So basically, the idea here is that whatever the foundation is, the simpler explanation is that it has no arbitrary limits. So adding complexity, adding more things, or adding some limit is actually not going to help someone that doesn't want to have arbitrary, or someone that does want to have arbitrary limits. So therefore, the foundation has no arbitrary limits. So that's chapter 6. Now, chapter 7 actually gets into a philosophy of mind, which is kind of like my area of expertise. I'm not going to get too much here, but what I will point out is that he uses what he calls that in order to produce minds from non-minds, this produces a construction problem. So I'm not going to quote much from here. However, he does say, give me a second here. Okay, so he says that, quote, when a scientist probes a brain, the scientist only has access to layers of gray matter, and even this access is mediated through the scientist's own experiences. By inspecting the aspects of the gray matter, the scientist witnesses third-person aspects like mass, motion, and molecular structure. The scientist does not witness the first-person sense aspect of your itchy sensation. So again, this is kind of the idea that this is kind of like the hard problem of consciousness, that you can't look at a brain and then try to say or try to experience what someone else is experiencing. So again, I'm not going to go much into this chapter because I think people should just read it. But yeah, it basically highlights, it gets into a philosophy of mind and points out that whatever the foundation is, the best explanation is that the foundation also has this mind-like nature. Otherwise, you're going to have this construction problem. So that's pretty much the basic idea. So now we're going to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is a little different. Chapter 8 goes into fine-tuning. And I'm not going to get too much into this chapter. But what I will point out is that he points out okay, so this is actually very interesting. I'm going to quote and let you guys kind of understand what he's saying here. So, quote, perhaps the real worry is not with minds per se, but with the idea of the supernatural mind beyond all material forms. The worry here is that science reveals natural causes, not supernatural ones. As I indicated in my previous chapter, I want to avoid stumbling over words. The words natural and supernatural have imprecise meanings that vary from person to person. My project is not to show you that any mind is beyond all that we know. Rather, I seek to explain how a mind could anchor the things we know. Rather than stumble over words, I propose that we work with other words instead. He says, quote, first, a foundational mind could have a rational nature. Its rationality is a feature by which the foundation acts in orderly law-like ways. So here he actually highlights the main problem with making the distinction between natural and supernatural. He believes, like I think we can all agree here, that distinction is arbitrary, that there's no reason to make that distinction between the natural and the supernatural, because it's kind of really hard to define what exactly we mean by natural and supernatural. And so again, I'm not going to go over too much into here, but what I will point out here is that he points out to like the theory of evolution and how evolution actually shows us that there can be some fine-tuning that kind of guided evolution in a certain direction, and that this would actually point to the fact that you would need a mind-like nature or mind-like thing to kind of guide evolutionary processes in a certain direction. So that's the basic idea. And so he says, quote, the very existence of an evolution in which turtles, giraffes, and humans can emerge reinforces the degree of fine-tuning in matter itself. The evolution of matter into creatures does not explain fine-tuning, it depends on it. Without a precise setup, no stable matter would exist, and hence no matter could even begin to evolve into anything. So he points out here that matter itself cannot actually form biological organisms without some fine-tuning or law-like nature that goes into the process. So that's basically chapter 8. So now chapter 9 gets to the foundation of morals, and again, I'm actually not that good with ethics, but if I'm going to summarize this chapter, the basic idea is, let me try to find a quote. So it says, oh, hold on, that's wrong. Okay, so this is kind of the end. He says, quote, "A moral foundation makes sense of the existence of both dimensions. A moral foundation has moral materials that allow for it to paint a morally textured world. Moreover, a moral foundation also has the power to create a world in which other moral beings like us can discover the moral landscape." So the basic idea is that in order for us to understand morality and understand a moral landscape, we have to have some foundation by which we do this in. And this is true for pretty much any theory of ethics that you go through. Now, of course, ethics is a little complicated, so I'm not going to get too much into it here. So I just recommend people read the book and see what they think. But now, chapter 10, he calls the foundation of reason, and he calls this what's called the mathematical landscape. So before, chapter 9, there is the moral landscape. In chapter 10, he calls it the mathematical landscape. And so, let me see if I can, So basically, so this, I think he gives an argument for why the foundation of things has to have some sort of rational nature. So, he says, quote, "Here is the root of the problem. Without an ultimate mind, the following three things are missing from the foundation. Number 1, a reason to produce people. Number 2, the resources to produce people. Number 3, principles of reason themselves." And so I want to also point out here that each chapter kind of builds off from itself. So chapter 10 builds from chapter 9, and chapter 9 builds up from chapter 8, and so on and so forth. So it kind of builds off arguments to kind of make like this cumulative case to kind of understand what the foundation of nature would actually be. So now chapter 11 is actually very interesting, because it gets into the perfect foundation. That whatever the foundation is, it has to have this perfect nature. And the reason why it has to have this perfect nature is because of basically value. He argues that value and desires and so on and so forth have to basically have... So we went over the fact that the foundation can't have has no arbitrary limits. And this would also include no arbitrary limits on its value. So if the foundation is valuable, and if it has no arbitrary limits, then its value would be infinite. Well, and if that's the case, well, then it would actually be perfection. That the foundation nature is perfection. That the foundation of reality is literally perfection. And if you go to page 150, exactly, 150, he summarizes the main argument in the book that he's giving. So this kind of like summarizes the whole thing. So premise 1, reality in totality is self-sufficient, with no outside cause or explanation. Premise 2, nothing can be self-sufficient without a perfect foundation. Therefore, reality has a perfect foundation. Reason fills in support for the premises. To support premise 1, reason reveals that nothing exists beyond the totality of all things. This means the totality of reality is self-sufficient. To support premise 2, reason reveals from multiple angles that any self-sufficient totality must have a perfect foundation. For an imperfect foundation generates two problems. Number 1, the problem of arbitrary limits, and number 2, the problem of construction. The first problem is internal to the foundation itself. A merely imperfect foundation would have arbitrary limits. Limits not only add unnecessary complexity, but they are not self-sufficient. By the uniformity of explanation, all limits alike have an explanation beyond themselves. Therefore, the foundation of all limits has no arbitrary limits. and so no arbitrary limit in value. Therefore, the foundation can only be perfect. Second, without a perfect foundation, we have a construction problem. An imperfect foundation lacks the materials for constructing the rest of reality. The rest of reality includes minds, matter, morals, and reasoning. A foundation of things must then include the resources to produce these things. By the light of reason, only a perfect mental and moral nature includes the resources to construct the mental and moral dimensions of our world. Therefore, the foundation has a perfect mental and moral nature. So he says, quote, "Your very existence verifies the first step of the bridge. Something exists. You are not just any something. Within you are many treasures, thoughts, feelings, emotions, material complexity, etc." And so, by the light of reason, he says, quote, "The foundation of all existence is the foundation of all treasures within you. By reason, you can see that the basis of your thoughts is not the chaos of non-thoughts. The basis of your senses are not nonsense. The basis of your reasoning with you is not reasonless motions. By the very light of reason, you can see that reason itself is the light within the foundation. By this light, the foundation can fashion a world with organization, purpose, and flowers. By this light, the foundation can anchor the moral landscape and paint the moral textures of your heart. By this light, the foundation can fine-tune a world for kingly creatures like you." So that's the conclusion of the book. That basically the idea is that this perfect foundation would include minds, morals, etc. And this perfect foundation is what we call God. Now, chapter 11, he kind of gets into the attributes of what the perfect foundation is, and that if the foundation is perfect, then it would also have to have the traditional attributes of God. So basically, all the attributes of God, like omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, all emerge or come from God's perfect nature. That God is perfection, and then from perfection, you get omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, etc. So that's the conclusion of the book. And then he kind of it's like a bridge that you have to like kind of build off of, and then eventually you get to the end, which is God. And I also want to point out here again that he's using pure reason to reach these conclusions. And so there's nothing in the book where he kind of sneaks in faith or whatever. Now, the last chapter has to do with challenging the bridge. And he gets into things like the problem of evil, certain objections to theism. So that's the basic idea, is that, he gets into, he kind of summarizes. Now, of course, the problem of evil, for example, that requires like a whole book in and of itself. So, of course, he's not going to, give a very long answer to that objection, but he does give his own thoughts and kind of some insight into that aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, basically the idea, again, is that God has a perfect nature, that God is perfection, and then from that perfection, you get God's attributes, you get omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. God is infinitely valuable, and that would be the foundation by which reality exists. Like, reality exists because of God, and like God, everything depends on God, because if everything is contingent, so like basically planets, stars, the universe, if it all has a dependent nature, then it must be grounded in something that's an independent nature, and this independent nature must have no arbitrary limits. Otherwise, the theory becomes complex and ad hoc, and it must have the resources to produce things like minds, morals, matter, etc., etc. So that's the basic conclusion of the book. Now, again, I didn't go over everything because I think that people should just read the book. I did go over a lot of concepts that I think are very important for people to understand. And I think this is a new argument, a different type of argument for God, because it kind of builds off from other concepts, it kind of builds off from other arguments for God, but then kind of combines them into one. And I think I might be doing a video on what I call the perfect foundation argument, and it's basically going to be that argument in the book. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think anyone that wants to understand philosophy of religion, anyone that wants to kind of understand how all that works, I would highly recommend everybody read this book, regardless of what you believe, because it really gives a new aspect on thinking about God and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. Anyways, if you have any questions, you can either ask me or maybe you can ask Josh Rajmian himself about, any concerns or whatever. But overall, I would give this book a 5-star because it's really good. Different type of argument for God, and so yeah. Anyways, thank you guys for listening. And I will be working on my videos again. I also want to give a shout out to Inspiring Philosophy for promoting my channel, because I got like a lot of subscribers within these past few days, so I'm really happy about that. And so yeah, again, just read the book. You can read the book for yourselves, and I think it's a different type of argument, but I think it works, and it really shows that if God exists, then he would have to be perfection. Now, one last thing I also want to mention is if you go to the chapter about matter, talking about matter. So if you go to chapter The Foundation of Matter, it says, quote, "While your canvas is private to you, my hypothesis is that the foundation's mind canvas is public. This mind forms material objects with its power of imagination. In this way, the ultimate mind causes material objects to appear rationally and orderly to the public's canvas, as we call the universe. I call this theory the imagination theory, because it explains material forms in terms of the imagination of the foundation. The imagination theory is just one hypothesis. Take it or leave it." So the reason why I'm pointing this out is because this is actually the imagination theory is literally idealism. Like it is idealism, because in that case you have God's imagination that would create the material world and everything that exists in the universe. And again, I just want to put that out because I think Josh is very sympathetic to idealism, and I even though he does write it from a dualist perspective, he does say that idealism could work with his foundation theory. So I found it very fascinating how he used that example, and it is very compatible with idealism and such. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you all get the book and let me know what you think. But have a nice day.